have the pleasure of chairing the last session of today, Preserving Individual and Collective Memories. It's a topic that interests me greatly because I can't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, so I'm curious to hear what our speakers say. We have 3 speakers. I will introduce each one just before they speak, and without further ado, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our first speaker, Lesia Savedchuk. Lesia, is this your abstract? I don't think your abstract. Well, I was worried because you had they're after the abstracts. Okay. Lesia Savedchuk is a writer, a storyteller, and a cultural animator who lives in Calgary. She is the author of 19 Ukrainian language books for young children, the Zveen Reader series, and has just self-published a book called Futbolny Detektive, a young adult novel. Lesia has recently, along with Andriy Sawchuk, taken on the modernization of the Voron Library and Archives in Calgary. Although she's not a professional librarian, she hopes that as a lover and collector of books and an experienced administrator, she'll be up to the job. And if you've ever been to Calgary and seen her library, it's fabulous.
Yeah, cool yards. Can you hear me? I know what it's like when you can't really hear the speaker. So, the topic listed in your program is Operation OPAC, bringing the Mykola Voron Library and Archives into the 21st century. Well, as it turns out, that's not what I'm going to talk about. Sorry. I believe the program says this presentation will focus mostly on detailing from a practical point of view our attempt at creating an online public access catalog. And the details will include OPAC platforms, volunteer and paid manpower, budgeting, hardware, etc., etc. Well, that was the plan, but best laid plans of mice and men, you know. Since January, when I sent in this presentation proposal, 2 curveballs have been thrown my way. The first was that all this progress, which I envisioned would happen by this time, and the details of which I would share with you, well, it didn't happen. It turned out that before tackling any cataloging, we had to do a lot of organizing and reorganizing of the card catalogs, first alphabetically, because there were a lot of mistakes, then numerically, so they matched the shelves. It took about 200 volunteer hours, so nothing exciting that I can tell you about there. The second curveball was that it was brought to my attention by one of the organizers, no names mentioned, that this conference was not about libraries and archives, it was about archives, and that the focus of my talk should be archives. Oops. Now what to do? So please forgive me for diverging from what was planned and from what is printed. I will still tell you a bit about our history and our holdings, and then I will speak to some of the challenges that we face, which perhaps some of you will share. A bit about us. Can I move this closer so that, no? Where's the little, or can I move this closer? Yeah. So as you perhaps read in the program, the story begins 60 years ago when 2 bookshelves were constructed in the basement of St. Vladimir's Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Calgary, and a then very young man named Mykola Voron began filling those shelves with books, some brought from a library which he had organized in the displaced person camp in Hanau, Germany. From such humble beginnings grew what I believe to be one of the largest Ukrainian community libraries in Canada. And since 2015, it has been called the Mykola Voron Library and Archives. Today, it overflows with mounds of treasure. We have almost 16,000 neatly stacked books in Ukrainian, in English, in other languages. We have approximately 150 linear feet. I know I'm supposed to say this in meters, but I didn't know that before. 150 linear feet of periodicals, small format periodicals. There's the shelves and some drawers. We have a small room full of newspapers. Almost 400 videos, you can see them at the end there, mostly commercial, I'm afraid, not archival. We have a map cabinet full of posters and documents. And then we have drawers and boxes full of what were mysteriously labeled archives when I took over. So for years, Pan Voron spent all his spare time here. And I mean all his spare time. Pani Voron was extremely understanding, and I don't know if his daughters ever saw him. He nurtured his baby. He acquired books and periodicals from all sources. He patiently made thousands and thousands of catalog cards. He didn't have other volunteers that helped him. He did this all on his own. He filled many, many folders and binders with press clippings on various topics. Once Ukraine declared independence, he spent countless hours corresponding with libraries and publishers in Ukraine. He sent off duplicates. He received many books and newspapers. He has several drawers called Vidrodzhena Presa Ukraine, small format periodicals from the time just post-independence. And how did he fund all this? I'm sure he had some support from users and from his parish, but he was also into some very creative fundraising. With the official blessing of his employer, the CPR, he collected bags and bags of empty bottles and cans, and he cashed them in order to buy books for the library. It was truly a labor of love. But young men get old, and Pan Voron is now in his 90s, and although he's in quite good health, he's no longer able to take care of his baby. He's no longer there to open the library regularly on Tuesdays for seniors, and on Sundays, Pan Voron was known to spend time in the library, not just after liturgy, but during liturgy. The library was now pretty well closed and unused, and even when it was used, it was difficult to find things. Since although you could use the card catalog to search by title and by author, you couldn't search anything by subject, since Pan Voron had only assigned accession numbers. So the first book he acquired was number 1. And the last one was number 15,000 and something. And that's exactly how they are shelved. And if you were looking for books on embroidery, and you weren't Pan Voron, who knew that there was, in the 5,000s, there were a bunch of large format arts and crafts books, and an excellent embroidery book at 14,622, well, you were SOL. So a couple of us, Arkady Chumak, who was hoping to be here but isn't, and myself took upon ourselves the task of bringing this rich resource into the 20th century and making it accessible online. We've just about decided on the OPAC system that we're going to use, and we have a draft cataloging process. We're hiring a student for 8 weeks this summer with the help of the STEP program. We have about 10 pretty committed volunteers, and we're ready to go at that library with all guns blazing. But this talk is supposed to be about archives, not about library. So now, knowing that I should be talking about archives, I started to familiarize ourselves with our archive holdings. It's called the library and archive. So I went through box by box, not every box, and drawer by drawer. Sorry, I don't have pictures. And I realized that really we have very little of what would be called traditionally archives. We have vertical files, which may one day be of archival value, not sure if they are now. We have binders of clippings on World War I internment operations, on the election of the president post-independence Ukraine, on John Demjanjuk and war criminals. Apparently we have Pan Voron's correspondence with John Demjanjuk when he was in prison in Israel, but I have yet to find those. We have the archives of the parish and its related organizations, but not complete. They're also somewhere else. We happen to have the personal archives of John Kolaski, who wrote Education in Soviet Ukraine. I have no idea why we have them, but we do. 2 boxes full. We have the archives of UNF Calgary, UNO, which no longer exists, quite well ordered. We have some posters and maps that are unceremoniously squashed into that lovely cabinet. I'm afraid to tackle them. And we have some individual items that are interesting. Some old periodicals. This is the program of the first Cook Congress, but I believe it's a copy, not an original. Still interesting. This is a poster that asks people to donate to the cause of the Western, during the First World War, the Western Ukrainian Republic. So that's quite interesting, but it's been laminated. So there are some interesting things, but in the grand scheme of things, this is not what I would call an archive. It's not a big collection. So then I decided to take a look at this from a different perspective. The reason I got into this gig, is that I love books. My house is jam-packed with them, as anyone who has tried to walk through my basement will attest. But as I marveled over the finds in Panvoron's library, I realized that the items that I got most excited about, probably the only items that I got really excited about, were old books. And it finally dawned on me that our library does indeed have a wonderful and large archival collection, one that is comprised of old books. This may not fit the traditional definition of archives, but I'm going to use it for now. Based on a sampling of about 5% of our collection, I estimate that about 3,000 of our books were published before 1950. And so they have a good chance of being a rare book and are certainly in need of being handled in the same way as archival materials. So a little taste of what we have. Oh, another poster. We have 2 shelves worth, so a shelf worth for us about that. 2 shelves worth of individual plays that were published in Western Ukraine in the early 20th century. They belong to a theater group that was connected to TUS, and apparently they put on a lot of plays and then eventually donated their collection to the archive. We have a wonderful 3 long shelves from a collection from Mr. Andriy Sawchuk from Vancouver. I don't know anything about this gentleman, but the story that Panvoron tells is that he got a letter asking whether the shelves in our library were metal or wooden. And he wrote back saying they were metal. And this gentleman wrote back and said, good, I'm going to send you some books. And he sent these books, mostly published in Western Ukraine, again in the early 20th century. Some perhaps published in North America, but most, I haven't looked through a lot of them. This is an example, Institutka Markovchuk. They're all stamped with Andriy Sawchuk's name. We have some first editions. It says here, Перше книжкове видання, Борислав Сміється, Іван Франко. We have some early Soviet editions, both from Lviv and from eastern Ukraine. So this particular one talks about the wonderful Stalin Constitution. We have books that were published in Western Ukraine before the Second World War, mostly textbooks that I've found that were used in various institutions of higher learning. The Ukrainian Reader on the left, I haven't been able to find any copy of it on WorldCat in North America. The only copy I found was in Copenhagen or Amsterdam, I don't remember. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's not on WorldCat, and certainly there aren't a lot of them. The one on the right is on letter writing. So these were from Austrian, Czechoslovakian publishing houses. I was thrilled when I saw this Tajemnici taxidermy. I thought, great, a textbook on taxidermy, but no, it's just a bunch of short stories. Anyway. And an old, this is 1914 calendar. Not sure where this was published, but if you look at the second page, it says Chervin on the one side and then Czerwiec on the other. I don't know what language that is. Would that be Czech or? I don't think it's Polish, is it? Anyway, so things like that. We have 2 whole units of almanacs and calendars. Publications of the DP camps. It was a very uncertain time, but also a time of very rich cultural activity, including publishing. So these are a couple of fiction items. The one on the left is one I really like. The covers are just terrific. Mandriuka Bezvist, it's a 1947 take on science fiction plus romance plus nationalism. Great. It's online with Diasporiana, so you can read it online. It's a good read. I haven't read the one on the right, but anyway, interesting cover. Again, textbooks for children on the left, for adults, driver education on the right. I don't know how much they tell you how to drive, but they tell you about the workings of the car. There's a lot of illustrations. So most of the DP publications were typeset, but occasionally there are things that were only typewritten and then printed. So I'm assuming there aren't too many of those around. North American publications. The one on the left was published in Montreal in 1918. I didn't even know there was a sizable community in Montreal at that time. Never mind a publishing endeavor. The one in the middle is from the States, and the one on the right is from the communist arm of the community. This is a very interesting find, a sex manual. We have 6 different copies of 5 editions, first published in Winnipeg and then in New York. What do you think, Lesia? Next cool exhibit? I'm sorry? Oh, you do? Oh, good. Illustrations in this one, too. Not the kind that you think, no. Being housed in a religious institution, we have a fair number of prayer books and Bibles. I have not really looked into them, but some of them look to be quite old. We have some things that Pandvoran is very proud of and thinks are very valuable, and I don't know if they are. If any of you know, it would be interesting to know if these are valuable. They are limited edition reproductions of old publications, and apparently Pandvoran paid big money for some of these, thousands of dollars. So if any of you know if these are indeed valuable, I would like to know that. Evangelia Anny Jaroslavne and Kievski Psalter are the 2 that we have. We also have a collection of Jehovah's Witness publications, some of them going back quite far, a shelf's worth. So some challenges and questions. So I guess in taking a look at these old publications, I realized that aside from the cataloging job, we also have challenges that are more archival. We have challenges of identification. Some of these items don't have where and when they were published, so they need to be identified. We have challenges of conservation. I didn't realize we would have to be putting books in individual acid-free folders, but we do have to do that. And challenges of access. Right now, all these books are interfiled with all our other books. Not that a lot of people access this library right now, but we don't really want people handling all these old items. So these are things that we now need to think about. Also, aside from the job of cataloging and organizing, we have come face to face with some bigger questions. So, target audience. Somebody mentioned, and today I think as well, that we don't just want to have our resources, we want them used. Of course we do. So we need to think about the very important question, who is going to use this resource, these resources that we have? In our case, certainly we will no longer have junior high or high school students coming for information about Ukraine for a school project. They now have the internet. They used to do this, but no longer. Second, people who read for leisure. Well, I recently published a small book in Ukrainian, and I can tell you there aren't a lot of people out there who eagerly want to and can read a Ukrainian language book from start to finish, although newer immigrants are starting to fill this void. So maybe not those casual readers that we had in the past. When my Kuma heard that I had taken on the Boden Library, she suggested that we need to start organizing events and book clubs. And I immediately put up a wall. No, that's not what I signed up for. But maybe we need to be not just repositories, but also community programmers and activists in order to reach our community. Libraries generally are now moving in that direction. Or perhaps the target audience of the Boden Library isn't the general community at all, but researchers and academics. But if so, how do we make ourselves known? Do we have to launch a marketing campaign? Should we try and align ourselves with a larger institution? This is something Bogdan suggested to me. Perhaps an academic institution? And then the other question that we're facing is, should we even be in the archives business? We are officially a library and archives. But since there are so few archives, do we give them to somebody else and focus on being a library? Would anybody know to come to us if they were writing a book on John Kolaski? Or, alternatively, should we try and become the repository of archives related to the Ukrainian community in Calgary? My very preliminary questions to community members about archives of our early community history produced nothing. No one seemed to know where anything was or if it existed at all. So, do we collect? Do we take an active role in encouraging archiving, but funnel collections to the provincial archives or another institution? Any of these options would be valuable, but I'm not sure if our people resources and our already overloaded space will stretch. And then there is acquisition and deacquisition. Seems we need policies or we will be overwhelmed. We are receiving offers of donations all the time, mostly books, some archives. 'Tis the season for downsizing. Everybody's getting rid of stuff. We've recently been offered a collection that is valuable but has nothing to do with Calgary, but hasn't been able to find another home. Do we take it? How many copies of Polovi Vidnosina do we need? Many questions, many challenges. I know that you know what I mean. So, to conclude, I originally made the proposal to present thinking that I would share with others the knowledge that we'd gained. But instead, I've come with questions. And having listened to all the speakers, I find I have more questions. But that's not a bad thing. We all start with questions, and hopefully forums like this one will help us find answers and move forward. We have an opportunity to benefit from the professionals and from a group like this. Panvaran didn't have that opportunity, and volunteers of his era didn't have that opportunity. So thank you for letting me be here and benefiting from this conference as a new librarian, as a researcher, as a family archivist, as all kinds of things. I've had all kinds of new perspectives. And I just want to say, you're all working in archives. If you ever get tired of working in archives and you need a break, we need volunteers, 16,000 books. Come to Calgary. We'll set you to work, and after a while, we'll take you to the mountains, and you can have a nice time. But, yeah. Thank you very much, Jeffrey.
Our next speaker, Winston Gereliuk, is the Ukrainian Cultural Center. He is a part-time research associate at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, where he is working on the labor history of Ukrainians in Alberta. He has worked for the Alberta Federation of Labour and the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees in Canada in the areas of research, education, public relations for over 25 years. He has served as an academic coordinator for industrial relations and human resource programs at Athabasca University. He has worked as an instructor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Alberta and as a professional officer in Manitoba's Department of Education. Not only that, he's almost like a genuine pioneer who grew up with a classic Ukrainian upbringing in a tiny house on the prairies with 9 kids or something, and he was a school teacher in a 1-room or 2-room schoolhouse, so get his autograph. These people are rare.
Better than that, 15 children in our family, and I failed grade 1 because I couldn't speak English properly. So there you go. I will only say a few things. Few disjointed thoughts, because that's the way I speak. I was asked to do this project, and I'm pleased to do it because I've spent most of my adult life in the labor movement. When I got tired of the labor movement, I'd go and rest for a while by going and teaching in a university. And then when I had my energy back up, I'd go back and work for the trade union movement. I just want to say a couple of things about where we're at right now. I have about 800 pages written on Ukrainian-Canadian labor history in Alberta. And I am now after primary, I'm after first-person sources if possible, I'm after reports that report on specific incidents. So this conference couldn't come at a better time for me. I'm now ready to go into the archives. I'm going to just renounce all of my social relations. My wife will see me when it's time for me to wash my socks and my undergarments. And other than that, I'm going to be in the archives. So it's wonderful to hear from you. I feel like I've taken a course in archiving. I've made valuable contacts. And having said that, I could sit down, but I'm not going to. Okay. I will tell you a few things about the project only. I could talk about it for a long time. The Alberta Labour History Institute's my base, really. We started that about 20 years ago. We've done a number of things, but we base labor history largely on oral history. We've done 400 plus interviews, and we've transcribed them all. It's incredibly expensive. We've asked the trade union movement for money. Anytime a leader sees me, they grab their wallet really quickly because they know that I'm going to be after a few thousand more dollars. Some unions have given really incredibly. The Health Sciences Association gives us $10,000 a year without even asking. okay, because they believe in the work we do. The 400 interviews, some of them, there's a couple that are over 10 hours long. So you can imagine the cost of transcribing and dealing with it. We do the proper consent form kind of things, and then we publish things based upon what we've. There's our website there, albertalaborhistory.org. The fact that we got that shows how many people are doing Alberta labor history. Okay? We do books. We do. I should have said we videotape all of our interviews. Videotape, then we transcribe them. We check with the person to make sure that we've got it right, and then we post the transcription on the web. All of the things that we do now are digital. We don't have to digitize everything or anything because everything's digitized to start with, and that is our repository, the website. So we've got those 400 interviews up there. And scholars have begun using our interviews, which we're really happy about. We've done a lot of booklets, books, video films, and other things. We published a few years ago, Working People in Alberta, a history, and I'll continue to do that kind of work. And I guess that it was because mainly my basis in the Alberta Labour History Institute that I was asked to do this work. I had to spend a year doing my reading because even though I began as a Ukrainian, I spent most of my life being raised as an Englishman. And so, I had to read both of Oris Martinovich's books. I don't think too many other people have actually done that. Just an incredible scholarship. Marunchak. I've read, a few people in this room. I could point out the people who I've read, and I've even read some of Yars Balan's works. Okay, and so I'm finished with that. I was able to get some of the specific stories, first-person accounts from these books. I was able to see what's out there, so that I could proceed now to actually look at some of the records. And the question is, where are the records? We approach our social history, because labor history is social history, but it's a special kind of social history. There is the Royal Commission on the relations between capital and labor that came out in 1889, just before the Ukrainians came. Every time there was a major period of labor unrest, the government would appoint another commission, and those commissions are valuable because in there you actually get people giving evidence of what it was like to work in a workplace. And so, this one has all kinds of stories of child labor, really quite horrible. If you don't want to fall asleep at night, just read that one, okay? And then we also, and this sort of illustrates it, the first major book to be published that talks about labor history directly from the experience of the people that were encountering it. And that's the Making of the English Working Class. A historian in Canada by the name of Brian Palmer wrote a book called Working Class Experience in Canada. And once again, he kind of provided us with a template as to how you write labor history. Okay, Ukrainian migrant labor. And this is just one of the themes, or if you want, one of the hypotheses, that you develop in the process of doing this work. And, that is that a Ukrainian diaspora, the Ukrainian immigration to Canada is, often cast in various lights. We cast it in an industrial relations context to say, what is it really all about? Industrial relations is about the relations between the people who provide the labor and the people who use the labor. And the people who use the labor, when they come together, they negotiate an agreement, either formally or informally, but there has to be some kind of agreement between the person who needs the labor and the person who provides it. And in some cases, the people needing the labor actually send for it. And that's what they did with the Ukrainians. My mom and dad came to Canada before the First World War as children, but they were brought to Canada not because they were good looking or because they were particularly wanted. In fact, they were the non-preferred, we know that. They were brought to Canada because their labor was needed. And so the thesis that I'm working from is that immigration policy, at least from the point of view of our people, was largely economic or labor policy. And in fact, if you look at immigration policy throughout the history of Canada, it's mainly economic, and a lot of it has to do with labor policy. So any sort of notion that there was something humanitarian about it, some idea that, they wanted, to provide a home for these poor suffering people, is wrong-headed for the most part. There were little humanitarian elements here and there, but for the most part, it was because their labor or they were needed for some other reason. And so, if you look at the, if you look further into it, you ask, well, why would these people even respond to the call for labor? It is because they were desperate. I just finished watching a film on the 1.2 migrant laborers who are in Qatar right now, housed in little boxes, essentially, providing the labor to build the facilities for the 2022 soccer tournament, the FIFA tournament. And the film contains interviews with these people. And invariably, when asked why they are here, the answer is because they were desperate. And they would desperately like to go home, even though in many cases home is not particularly a good place to go. And it was the same with our people. This was the first wave. In the case of the second wave, and I'll get to that in a minute, but in the case of the second wave, the reasons for going after them changed somewhat. Now, every time you have a diaspora, I did some work at the International Labour Organization in Geneva, and I did some work on migrant workers. And invariably, what you'd hear from the people conducting the research is when you look at migrant labor, when you look at diasporas like that, you're often looking at the face of human misery. Because the people who are essentially leaving their homes forever are leaving it out of desperation, and because living conditions have become intolerable. And then, invariably, they become migrant labor. Because wherever they go, the Syrians leaving right now, the Africans and others that have flooded into Germany, eventually there's going to be somewhere there a labor contract. They're going to have to find work because you're going to have to work to stay alive. The government may support you for a while. So the migrant workers are created in various ways, and what my story is going to be when it comes to talking about the immigrants is, the reasons why they came, what they found when they came, and I would really like to tell it from the first-person perspective, if possible. And it doesn't help, by the way, when they receive a hostile reception, which is, of course, what our people faced. They came, and I'm going to skip over this really quickly, because of plans that were firmly in place that were made not where they came from, but made in central Canada. And there's the way that the national policy under which they came to Canada is depicted by somebody who didn't particularly care for the national policy. The cow was being fed in the west and being milked in the east. And our people were part of feeding the cow in the west. Okay. Another part of it is another thesis, another approach is to understand that when our people came in that first wave, they were colonial settlers, and those, by the way, that's a picture of the country wives who were left when the real wives of the Hudson Bay and Northwest factors came west. Quite often the country wives were left to fend for themselves. But the real story is the relationship that developed between the indigenous people who were displaced from the land and the colonial settlers who were brought in, our people and some other people, to make sure that the land was settled and that these people essentially would never return to the land. Homestead, I think that when I first was hired to do this job, or when I first started writing about labor, I think people thought I'd write about trade unionists. And I will write about them a little, but not very much. Homesteaders supplied the labor. The form of labor that was needed was a kind of cheap labor that was willing to work under incredibly difficult conditions. And the reason why you only see women there is because the other aspect of the immigration policy that was developed, and I know darn well that they thought of this, that they knew it would happen, that when you dump people at the side of the railway on a piece of raw land, that they're not going to make a living on the raw land for a long time. It would only become productive after a period of work. So they knew darn well that they were also importing people that they badly needed for the frontier industries. The railway building, the mining, the lumber camps, and a few other things. And I'll just skip right along to tell you that they knew that they'd be needed for urban labor purposes too. And the really interesting part of the story is, this, by the way, the reason I took that picture is because the urban workers who came to work in Edmonton, building the legislative buildings, building other of the buildings that were built during the boom, lived on that bank. Many of them lived down here, and they called it the Galician Hotel. Okay? Now they put the funicular there. Okay, but the interesting part of urban labor is when you look at the kind of labor that was provided in some of the communities that sprang up in the block settlements. So there you start talking about a different kind of labor. The small businessmen, the people who set up businesses like blacksmith shops, ran the grocery stores. My uncle ran an insurance industry up in Elk Point. Another uncle ran a general store in Clandonald. These were agrarian urban centers in which a lot of work was done, and you can't write a story about labor, about Ukrainian labor history, without mentioning them. Okay? I don't have to get into this. It was master-servant law in those days. And, you weren't supposed to leave the employ of the master without the express consent of the master. You would be brought back to work by the mounted police. If you tried it twice, you'd get thrown in jail. Anyway, these people didn't care. They were building the Canadian Northern Railway through Edmonton, which arrived in 1905. And at a certain point, they had a dispute. So you see how they pulled their machines and their horses to one side and waited for the dispute to get settled. Okay? People who are up against it, and lots has been written about the desperate conditions under which frontier laborers work, the desperate conditions under which homesteaders provided the labor that was needed to open the West. People who are in that kind of position only get ahead if they engage in collective action. So, I want to talk a little bit about that. They were given very little support by the government. They built their churches. They built their schools. That is Robert Fletcher, by the way. When the language question arose in Alberta, he came out to ensure that there wouldn't be any Ukrainian language instruction in the school. And when the school board, which had built the school, spent the money to staff it, did everything necessary to make the school run, when they refused to go along with him and continued to provide some language instruction, he would place them under trusteeship, and he would take over the running school division. I believe he took over about 23 school divisions that way. When I worked for the Department of Education in Manitoba, I worked in the Robert Fletcher building. You know where that is, right in Portage, right across from the bar. The halls and the reading rooms are another part of the story. You see, I want to write about the working class experience. The halls, the reading rooms, Prosvitas, the Chitanyas, they're all part of that. And that, of course, the Winnipeg Labor Temple. There were just hundreds and hundreds of halls started by church organizations, community organizations, the ULFTA, and on we go. The working class experience also involves political action, okay? And, I will go into some of the political action that took place, some of the electoral politics. The Liberal Party, as we all know, was dominant, but Socialist Party of Canada was started in 1907. Generally, the workers found that in the existing political parties, they couldn't gain any footage or any mileage, so they would start their own political parties. Okay? Then, of course, Mark Minyenko talked about us being declared enemy aliens. It's amazing. A few years after they imported us, because they needed our people, there was a recession, then right after that there was a war. And it's looking at it from an industrial relations perspective, it was interesting that when a labor shortage occurred in about 1916 because of the war, that suddenly they needed these enemy aliens. And so they were released as parole labor to build many of the facilities. The Cavan Basin in Banff, they cleared the land for the Jasper Park Lodge. When I teach my week-long labor history courses there, I tell my students to go across the lake and look at the rock that stands where an internment camp was. But see, that's a labor relations story because, okay, I'm going to quit. Yeah, okay. There's the rock, and Mark Minyenko talked about that, and you can bet that I'm going to talk about that too. The Bolshevik Revolution had an incredible effect on workers, on the mentality of, on the social psychology of the working class. The Great Labor Revolt in Winnipeg, the government, was replicated in Alberta, something most people don't know. Everybody talks about the Winnipeg General Strike. The fact is that workers in Edmonton, Calgary, and Lethbridge walked out. The response of the government has to be talked about. Section 98 of Canada Criminal Code. If there ever was, a piece of repressive legislation, authoritarian legislation, it was that. And I will, of course, talk about that. It's important to talk about what happens when the veterans came home, because being migrant labor, they would obviously, being enemy aliens, they would point to the fact that the Ukrainians were working, that they were doing so well. They were able, farms expanded during the First World War. The second wave came, and because the railway companies and the land companies demanded it. So they not only needed the labor, but now they needed customers and they needed people to buy the land. And so labor. The second wave changed the discourse. That's when the kind of divisions started to really arise in the Ukrainian community, the kind of thing that kept me away from the Ukrainian community for quite a while. Okay? This was evident, for instance, in the 1934 farmers' strike, when we had the two sides of the debate, and as somebody said earlier, there was no middle ground, engaged in open and violent clashes with each other. Okay? There's a meeting in 1932 in the Memorial Hall in Edmonton of the Ku Klux Klan. That was another phenomenon that our people had to put up with. Their primary issue was that these Ukrainians were Catholics and Catholics were polluting the race, and Then, of course, the Cold War. Somebody mentioned that, the effect that it had on labor history of our people. And I just want to close off by saying that history tells us who we are. When people look into the mirror that history provides, and when they see something that doesn't reflect who they are, but reflects who somebody else is, you are doing an incredible amount of damage to people. It's really hard finding histories that talk about working people. Over and over again, when people look in the history books or look at some of the history that's done, they are seeing people who, for one reason or another, are famous, are notable. They're not seeing themselves. So when you deny people their own history, you're essentially doing what Lord Durham tried to do to the French people in 1838, when he examined the causes of the uprisings in Upper and Lower in Canada, and went back and wrote a report and said, the French are a people without a history, without literature. If we combine them with the English, we will save them from their own inferiority. Those are his words. And they will forget that they were ever French. The reason we started the Alberta Labour History Institute and why I'm happy to be doing this book is because I want people, when they look in the mirror, to not only see the rich and famous, the beautiful or the not so beautiful, okay? That's Donald Trump and his wife, okay? And I want them to be able to see themselves reflected in history. And so when I hear about how short-staffed, how under-resourced our archives are, you know, how little attention is paid to providing people with the resources that they need to preserve their history, it causes me concern. Because, you know, you're doing damage. You're not allowing people to preserve the history that needs to be preserved. There, I kind of rushed it, but nobody fell out of their chairs, so nobody fell asleep. Thank you.
Our third and final speaker on this panel is Andriy Sawchuk, who hails originally from St. Catharines, but has lived for the past 14 years in the nation's capital of Ottawa. He has been always active in the Ukrainian community since childhood. He has an interest in Ukrainian and Canadian history, and he has a BA in art history and archaeology from Brock University and an MA in art history and museum studies at the State University of New York in Buffalo. Andriy has worked at the Niagara Falls Art Gallery. If you've ever been there, you'll know they have a huge collection of the Last Temptations of Christ series by Winston Gereliuk, as well as other museums and galleries in Canada and the U.S. He taught English in Taiwan for 3 years, so if there are any questions in Chinese, you're welcome to ask him. And he worked for the federal government for 9 years. More recently, he took part in several missions, election missions observing the elections in Ukraine and Moldova. His latest stint, though, is of particular interest, and that's been working on contract with Library and Archives Canada, processing the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee funds. He'll be telling you about his experiences with this thing. So he's been working on the Cook archives, and he's been sending me bits and photographs of bits and pieces of them, and it's a real treasure trove for sure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Yars. Thank you for coming to hear me today, and a little bit about me quickly. I know that Yars just said it, but I'll just give a little bit more too. Originally from St. Catharines, but now live in Ottawa. Third generation Canadian, and I trace my roots to North End, Winnipeg, and Russell, Angusville, Manitoba. My grandparents decided to move to the Fruit Belt in Niagara during the Second World War. So there I grew up in the Ukrainian community, knowing all about our immigrant waves, participating in the community, and listening to what it was and is to be a Ukrainian Canadian in Southern Ontario, but still with prairie roots. My keen personal interest has carried me to where I am. I moved to Ottawa 15 years ago, working politically on the Hill for almost a decade. After this, I took on various contracts in different fields. Recently, I was very fortunate to work on 2 short-term contracts with Library and Archives Canada. Starting at the end of the summer of 2017 and finishing just at the end of this past March. Now I'll be talking with you today about what I found in the last few months there in the Gatineau, Quebec building. Now everybody sees archives as the one on, close to Parliament Hill. The actual work goes on across the river in Quebec in kind of a residential commercial area. So here, I'm here to let you know what scratching surfaces and going off on tangents looks like when you are going through old Ukrainian Canadian documents. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with this though. Being in Ottawa, I became a part of the Ukrainian community there. I was fortunate enough to know our keynote speaker for this conference, Miron Momryk, ever since I moved to Ottawa, oh so long ago. Mr. Momryk has truly had a super whirlwind of a career with the Canadian government, with a focus on preserving our community stories, and he continues to be active in the communities as we see today. All of us have that experience with him. When Mr. Momryk was still working at Library and Archives in 2005, he convinced the executive director of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress at the time, Ostap Skripnik, to donate the materials that were housed at Osiraduk in Winnipeg at the time. Inside this collection, meeting minutes, correspondence, photos, project workings, and so much more to be safeguarded in the vaults of our government. Almost 300 bankers' boxes were transported and remained unprocessed due to Mr. Momenich's retirement. Safe? Yes. But accessible to the public? Not yet. I have been transferring the material into acid-free folders and then organizing them into standard archival boxes that fit neatly on archival shelves. The material in the original bankers' boxes was already very well organized. My job was to transfer the documents and other material into an even more streamlined order. This includes deaccessioning of extraneous materials, which have been just under 10% of the collection so far. The next steps include working on the finding aids and writing up the descriptive tools. You can see here what my processing room looks like. Bankers' boxes in the foreground and archival boxes on the shelves in the back, getting ready to be tagged and coded. This phone is not the biggest, but it is exceptionally large and extensive, spanning several decades, 1939 to the late 80s and even early 90s sometimes, just up until electronic mail arrived. I have found some straggling contents also from the 20s and early 30s, but it's not the norm. Nowadays, we just look for the search function on our email servers. We forget how organized we once were. To keep on top of all our issues and projects, we can also really learn from this polite correspondence, the polite pre- and post-amble writing with organized thoughts in this correspondence. When we say CC'd, it actually meant sheets of carbon copies so that we could follow along on complete correspondence conversations. And it's very well organized there, from Second World War up until the Multiculturalism Act and beyond. A very thorough order was kept with much of this collection. The uniqueness of this collection is that it touches every and all organization and even individuals involved in the Ukrainian-Canadian community from the 30s up, and then some. This collection is more of a sweeping generalist brushstroke on the community. Generalist, since it touches on so many of the initiatives of our history. This collection is good to fill in the blanks or to verify any of your facts. But of course, one can always find one of those I didn't know that moments also, where everything seems to fall into place. Back to the artistry of correspondence, beautiful handwriting. I mean, I was amazed by it. Has changed to stylized type fonts, and pleasantries are now just the act of cutting and pasting. As I mentioned, scratching surfaces and going off on tangents, I better start showing you now just a tease from this huge collection. A letter from the Prime Minister, Winston Gereliuk, was one of the first wow moments when I started going through the collection. The brief Prime Minister of the very short stint of Carpatho, Ukraine. This letter was written and sent at the end of January 39 to the Ukrainian community in Saskatoon. It was mailed to the precursor of the RCUC, Representative Committee of Ukrainian Canadians, right before the Ukrainian Canadian Committee was formed. Of particular note was the back of his envelope. It was simply addressed as Master or Magister Dr. Winston Gereliuk, Prime Minister. What a great return address. Unfortunately, we know that the title and address was short-lived with tragic consequences soon after. On the other side of the Atlantic, UCC was being formed and trying to organize itself as a cohesive body, especially for World War II. Here you will see, you'll find a handwritten page from a partial list of Ukrainian Canadian soldiers that were serving overseas. You may find their service number next to their name, sometimes their rank, and whether they were fighting in the Air Force, Army, or Navy. Also, sometimes you will see where they were located, or if they were missing in action or killed. Check out one of the names there, Bill Fischuk, killed in Holland. How did they come across this information? It was word of mouth, but also sending out questionnaires. Here you'll see on the right side. On the right side, a handwritten list that family members filled out for the UCC. During this time, there was also an initiative to get the Ukrainian Canadian Servicemen Association off the ground in the UK. They even had their own news booklets printed so that the boys could stay in touch and have a home away from home with their clubhouse. But after the association closed down right after the war, it was only logical to start a veterans club. So here's one of the first copies of the Ukrainian Canadian Veterans Association, UCVA, publications from October 1946. You will find plenty of letters and other information on the men and women who served in the Second World War. Post-war also saw the formation of the United Nations, and there is quite a bit of information on how diligent the UCC was to follow up on helping out the displaced Ukrainians across Europe and of other countries by attending meetings in San Francisco or even in Lake Success, New York. That's the precursor, before the permanent site of the UN came about. Here you will find copies of these small blue booklets. I can't stop but be reminded that these are the antithesis of the Little Red Soviet or Communist books. And here you will see an acknowledgement of receipt from the UN with regards to a memorandum sent out about displaced persons from 1946. The memorandum is also found in the collection. And I saw signatures by Herbert Hoover, who was the past president, as well as Eleanor Roosevelt. So it's quite impressive who sometimes the Ukraine Canadian Committee had correspondence with. When I mention of other countries, I mean it. One can find displaced Ukrainian letters from Iran, Morocco, Colombia, China, Lebanon, and more. Here you will see the displaced Ukrainians near Lake Tanganyika in Eastern Africa from the mid to late 40s. There is plenty of information out there on the Polish settlements that were made as temporary camps, but there were quite a few Ukrainians as well, and little is known about them. Letters and photographs attest that they were there as they write about the persecution of Ukrainians in these camps. You will see the photos here of young Ukrainian ladies in their embroidered finery in front of the Orthodox Church in Tengaru, and also the congregation in front of the church named Saint Volodymyr. But of course, one of the stark images that show us that we are not in Bukovina or Drohobych or in Smoky Lake is the blessing of the water on the Feast of Jordan at Lake Duluti in present-day Tanzania. Now, I don't want to focus this collection on only 1940s and 50s, but these were the more fascinating topics that piqued my interest. Another great saving of documents here were the telegrams. Everything from dignitary congratulations at gala functions to sympathies on community deaths or urgent reminders to the more mundane, when the train or the plane would arrive. But these serve as valid and helpful verification tools for historical perspective. This particular telegram is from Dr. VJK, the legend, for the confirmation of the Prime Minister's audio recording to the community in 1951. As national pride is concerned, and showing what Canada meant to Ukrainians, here's a version of the Canadian National Anthem from 1946 with Ukrainian lyrics. And there were some different lyrics too, I found, from different years. This collection is not only limited to letters and photos, but also contains musical scores and poetry. So culture always is in play, intermingling with the social and political sides of this phone. And we cannot be too centric on Canada alone with this collection. As you will see in this next slide, Ukrainian language newspapers from the US and Brazil also helped mold our identities, not to mention Ukrainian publications from Belgium, France, Germany, and the UK. But there's plenty of material in this collection on also how the diaspora worked together with the gathering of knowledge, not only through letters and newspapers, but also through the PAUK, the Pan-American Ukrainian Congress, and later the SKVU, the World Congress for Ukrainians, minutes. The volumes of minutes from all the UCC congresses are also in this collection. So detailed were they that I was able to find out that my grandfather was an observer delegate at the first Congress in Winnipeg, and that over half of the hotels used for the Second Congress in 1946 held in Toronto were either owned or managed by Ukrainians, among so many other facts. An oddity that I also wanted to include is this Christmas card from Italy. It was sent from Naples and finally reached Winnipeg, probably after 47 February. But if you can see the scorch marks on the side, it's stamped with a damaged and delayed by fire stamp across the address of the UCC. If only this card could explain its story and path, and of course about whatever happened to its senders, the Holod brothers. Why were they in Naples? Were they on some POW or DP lists? Now, coming back to Canada, particularly 1961, one can see what the community wanted to take stock of its numbers. Now, Andriy, this is what I was talking to you about. I chose the Alberta page, but the list includes the provinces and territories with tallies of all acknowledged Canadians of Ukrainian heritage from across the country. Specific towns or cities have tallies with their percentages too. These numbers would inevitably help UCC later make cases in having Ukrainian school programs in specific regions and provinces across Canada, which can also be found in this collection. And also, besides this tally, there were some other ones which are from the early 40s, just when UCC was being formed. Advocacy work and its dissemination of what was happening in Soviet Ukraine and the Soviet Union was also part of the UCC's mandate. You will find plenty of reports, speeches, and articles from member organizations about this. This image is the first page of a sad report about women in the gulags from the late 50s, brought to us by the World Federation of Ukrainian Women's Organizations. Plenty of material can be found on the Helsinki Group and other dissident projects and awareness programs. As I mentioned about dissemination of news, here you can see the RCI and CKJS radio stations. They had their lineups of ethnic media shows and were at the forefront of technology and multiculturalism. Nowadays, live streaming, podcasting, we get anything we want from anywhere. But it was a big deal back then. Perhaps you may recognize someone in the portraits. This collection also has the actual paper transcripts of the RCI during the 50s. And if Radomir is around, he's in that photo. Now, as archives continue to proclaim what happened yesterday, this collection has plenty of posters, flyers, concert booklets that were kept for posterity throughout the years and are now ready to be used by the future researcher. Everything from concerts to political gatherings to memorials. One can find them in this collection. Ukrainian current events from 1946 from a speaker from Rochester, New York, to the 49 big rally, Vice, at the Winnipeg Playhouse, to the Jubilee Music Concert that was held here in Edmonton quite a few years ago, to the commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the death of Simon Petlura in 1956. Not to forget about the future leaders of the Ukrainian communities in Canada, one can find publications and initiatives that university student groups were working on. They were also working with student clubs from abroad. Here's a commemoration booklet to the anniversary of the Battle of Krute, the first battle against communism. On the 40th anniversary of this day, it was published by the Central Union of Ukrainian Students, the Federation of Ukrainian Students of America, the Ukraine-Canadian University Students Union, and the Ukrainian-Argentinian Students Union. Quite the cast of contributors. The other publication is brought to us titled simply Ukrainians in Canada, from the Ukrainian National Youth Federation of Canada. Now, one of the more exotic topics I found was Ivan Svit, or John Sweet. He was a stamp collector who was heavily involved with the Ukrainian communities in Asia. He came from Kharkiv, I believe, when he was 18 years old, and lived in Zeleny Klen in that area. His final destination was to be in New York City. And so he reached out to the UCC from Alaska and wanted to offer a speaking tour on the topic of Ukrainians in Asia and the Green Wedge, the Zeleny Klen. Those are photos of the Ukrainian community in Shanghai during the 40s. After his speaking engagements in the early 50s, nothing more is found in this collection. One of the final slides that I will show you deals with informational pamphlets that are in Ukrainian. How to maneuver employment insurance in Canada. A how-to on animal husbandry and how to make friends. All very helpful books to the Ukrainian Canadians of the day. Now, in case you did not understand the Canadian government documents in English, the government was willing to translate them into Ukrainian. This was during the multicultural awakening in the early 70s. This, though, proved challenging, and the UCC became an advocate for these communities, for their own communities. Here's a letter from UCC to the Employment Office of Canada explaining the nuances of understanding a contemporary literary Ukrainian from Kyiv and the Ukrainian spoken in Canada. Страхування по безробіттю versus забезпечення на випадок безробіття. comparing the two linguistic evolutionary lingos to Parisian French and Quebecois. In conclusion, you may have never seen any of this, or you have seen everything that I've shown and you understand it. So this collection is exactly what UCC is. It's an umbrella organization of the majority of Ukrainian organizations in Canada. And that generalist feeling, all-encompassing overview of the last few decades. It is here for you, once it gets opened, to fill in any cracks and enrich us with the fuller understanding of what went on in Canada with the Ukrainian lens. Eventually, this will be available to the public. You may find the missing time gap, or that list of names from whatever your project you may be working on is. Or you may find something that you may have overlooked over the years and forgotten. One must appreciate that UCC was and is the umbrella that involved itself with all things Ukrainian and Canadian, and that the guardians of the decades did an outstanding job in ensuring that our past can be examined and compared to our present and future. I did not mention anything about the political correspondence signed by prime ministers, ministers, senators, MPs, and Canadian government bureaucrats from all the decades, but it is also in there. I thank you for your attention and patience, as I am the last speaker of the day, and hearing me out on this project. So, and this will be available in due time. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions. I see two so far. Yes.
I have to go to a union function, believe it or not, and I'm supposed to be there at 5:30. And I notice it's 25 after 5. So I'm sorry, I have to run. I'll see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Winston. Oh, we got a few back here. Okay, Jim Adams, you'll start with you.
Well, I was the first. Okay.
I owe you, because I was hard on you earlier, so.
Okay. It's probably more of a comment than a question. Sorry, I forgot the name.
Lesia.
Sorry?
Lesia.
Lesia. Just thinking about your particular case with that library. I was just thinking about like the overall recurring question that we're asking: how to make this your institution legit, how to make it sustainable into the future. I think in this day and age, it's very difficult to rely on just the support of the Armada, of the just community, in terms of getting the funding for the operations. So I think the two more sustainable options is one thing is make yourself, meaning your institution, an attraction. So selling yourself to the general public in some form, and the second is selling yourself to the government, either municipal or provincial or federal, and getting funding that way. And that's what the Ukrainian Village Party did. They became an attraction, a tourist attraction on the provincial scale, and they sold themselves to the government and got funding from the government. So to make a sustainable model, you just have to look into those models somehow and really rethink what you're doing in those terms. So that's kind of my feedback.
Thank you for the suggestion.
I actually, while I'm walking over there with the thing, I've got a question for Lesia, or something that involves Marina and Lenine. A couple of years ago, we went to Calgary, to the basement of late Andriy Sawchuk, and we harvested a small portion of what was there. I mean, it's a huge collection we built over many years. But there are a lot of interesting things, but the really interesting thing, there was a bunch of stuff about organizations in Calgary that I had never even heard of, or, you know, there's archival material there. Now, some of the stuff I think we brought here. It's been a while since we looked.
Well, we decided to go back shortly after, and we never did.
And we never did, so there's more stuff there. But that's something, if you want to build, I mean, to me, the logical place to build an archive on the community life in Calgary is at the Library and Archives that you're involved in.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to Dr. Maletsky's stuff. I know Petro asked me about where they are, and I will have to ask around. They may still be with his son, no?
They were gonna sell the house, but I think that because the real estate market tanked, that there's still, that his mother, the widow is still living in the house.
Oh, okay.
And that's why I haven't heard anything from him. He said he would write to me. He said there's no hurry.
How long ago did you take the...
2 years ago?
2 years ago.
Oh, okay. I'll see what I can find
Andriy, I have a question to you.
Yes.
I was wondering at what level the description will be available of this form.
I'm not sure. I can't tell you that.
Oh.
Right now, it's just the processing stage.
Okay.
And I'm not working there right now, so
So someone else is doing.
it's on a complete standstill because nobody reads Ukrainian.
Oh, that's what I was
Canada. So hopefully in the next few weeks or months, I'll be. learning from
They
them.
may hire you and you will
Exactly.
continue working.
Yeah.
Okay. So what has been completed so far?
Out of the almost 300 boxes, I have 7 boxes left.
Okay.
And I've been compiling them down. So for 6 months, that's all I was doing.
So were you reading out duplicates or were you
I was reading out
arranging
a
them?
lot of extras.
Mhm.
Extras, as in sometimes there was some proclamation, 20 copies.
I see.
We don't need 20 copies. So, yeah. So there is out there quite a bit of information that could fill up other people's archives.
Well, now we know who to talk to when we need something.
My question to Lesia. You mentioned that you have a fund of John Koliaska. So I'm wondering how large this fund is and what kind of documents does it contain?
I haven't looked at it in detail, but there are 2 banker's boxes. I know that there is his personal correspondence and some of his notes and research, and I haven't looked farther than that.
Is Mr. Vorin from Bukovina? I asked because Kolaski was, and maybe that was the.
I don't think so, but I'm not sure.
Okay, just curious how it ended up in.
I don't know how they connected, but
Any other questions? Peter Melvitsky.
Andriy, thank you for that condensed family history. That's really quite fascinating. So, a personal question.
Mhm.
Are you related to Terry Sawchuk?
No.
I just wanted to make a comment that at St. John's the Baptist Cathedral here in Edmonton, Lesia Gereliuk has just completed cataloging over 5,000 books. So they have dealt with the same issue that you're currently doing, and I think she had some help as well, but largely she did it herself and put it on a computer. But and access to it, and they had to cull, and they had boxes of books and duplicates, and I think they've sent quite a number of extras to Ukraine and that sort of thing.
yes, and some of those duplicates are now in my house.
Yeah.
She was very, she shared everything that she did. She was very helpful. It was wonderful to meet with her.
Okay, thank you.
In the UCC collection, will there be correspondence and maybe other related material on the founding of the UCC?
Definitely, yeah. That's one thing that it was very detailed. As I was talking about the UCC, there's also all the minutes, what time the meetings were started, who said what, who showed up, where it was held, and that's for the RCUC, so the precursor to UCC.
And the government of Canada involvement, or?
You know, I'll tell you, as I wasn't researching, so I was reading as much as I could, but my job was to put them in the archival boxes, so I can't, what should tell you.
I have a question coming to Lesia. First, thank you for your presentation. I did say to Lesia that this is an archival conference and ask her to focus on archival collections of the Colorado Library and Archives. But that was done specifically so you look at those boxes, because otherwise you wouldn't look into them for years to come.
I would have, but not this quickly.
Not that quickly. I know several places who have their library wonderfully organized and they're just scared to look into those weird archival boxes, into those papierчики. So that was, I think it worked. And the second one, I do realize that most of us have library collections together with archives and sometimes museum or artifacts collections. And we do want to talk about this because it's part of our heritage, Ukrainian Canadian heritage. We just needed to focus on something in particular for this event. But we will be continuing to talk, especially because of this need to share, because we all have duplicates. But what if we don't have one that you have? So we hope that this will be part of the collaboration that grows out of this event.
I hope so, that'd be great.
Thank you.
In the Cook archives, I had heard that for years, kicking around in the Cook office, there was a history of Ukrainian theater in Canada written by a man named Andriy Sawchuk. He published under M. Pilipenko, but it seems to have disappeared. You haven't stumbled it in one of those boxes, because I'd love to find that book.
Yeah,
a manuscript.
I know you mentioned it. I haven't seen anything, but it doesn't mean it's. I could have just in the theater section.
I'd really like to know what happened. And then last year, just another thing, there is still, I believe in Calgary, an active hall for the AUC.
Yes.
Have you had any contact with them? Because
I haven't. And I'm sure that somebody mentioned to me that some of their either books or archives came to Pandora. And yet I now can't remember who that was. The person who I thought it was denies having said that. So I'm not sure if anything came from them or not. I don't know if anything exists there still in the way of...
years ago I had a friend who was in a second-hand bookstore, and in there they have the entire run of Robitnitsa, the journal came out in the 20s. It was edited by Miroslav Yevchan, and so he called me and he said, "Yanis, do you want it? I can buy it." And I said, "Absolutely, absolutely." He went back and it was gone. I have a feeling somebody may have just pinched it from the hall, took it in, and then maybe somebody found out about it and maybe went back. But that's part of the problem with some of these archival collections. Some people figure like, ooh, they could be worth money. They end up being broken up and sold off and hived off in different pieces. So.
Yeah, I will try and find out if there is still something there. I haven't found anything as a collection in our library that came from.
Serge, one more, I think this will be it.
Yeah, this is just a small comment to Lesia about the library and archives in Calgary. There may not be that much in your archives, but of course, your archives have materials that other archives don't. And I know this from experience because I recently published a book on Canada and the Holodomor. And during the course of the research, there were references, after references, about thousands of letters that had reached people in Canada from their relatives in Ukraine. And the first question that arises is, where are those letters? Well, in fact, there are so few. The Mennonites have preserved some. There are a few here in Edmonton and the provincial archives. But one of the most original letters, which I used, thanks to the Colorado, was a letter that had been sent from a girl in Ukraine to her father in Calgary. And that's in your archives. It's the surname was Devos.
Devos?
So, yes, so thank God for your archives. And
Carlo's success story, and I think we've had a successful day today. I thank everyone for your participation. Before you go, some of you purchased the banquet tickets. Unfortunately, there's a limited number of seats, so there are no more seats available. What time does it start?
7:30.
7:30.
So you have some
Okay.
time to enjoy the
Shirley?
banquet and then come to I will not be attending the banquet. Someone can have my ticket.
We can have a student.
I'd love that.
Okay, so we're going to have a student. Shirley is donating her ticket to a student, so thank you very much for that. And thank you again.